He gave her 20 minutes to sell her soul. Bleeding and standing in a trashed apartment, Arya learned her brother was just taken by the Volkov cartel. She had exactly one option: call the terrifying stranger from the restaurant. Leon's offer over the phone was simple. I'll get your brother back. I'll handle your abusive ex, but in exchange, you belong to me. She stepped into his black SUV, not knowing if she was being saved, or walking into a much darker hell.
Look closely at the subject in the mirror. She is applying a classical dissociative mask. The bathroom bulbs hum with a sickly light, casting exhausted shadows beneath Arya's eyes. She presses a damp towel to her swollen lip, observing the water turn a rusted red. She forces her mouth upward, rehearsing a purely mechanical smile. She has no idea the man observing her tonight will completely dismantle her reality by dawn. You and I are going to examine this psychological collapse together. Her partner, Marcus, exhibits textbook cowardly sadism, inflicting trauma where society cannot see it. His strikes are calculated to break her internally while keeping the exterior functional. But remember this clinical truth. A mask might hide your deepest trauma from the world, but it inevitably traps you alone in the dark with the one hurting you. There is a clinical tragedy in observing a fractured psyche attempt to paint over physical trauma. Arya scrapes the last drops of foundation from a tiny bottle. Her nervous system is failing. Her fingers tremble under the harsh light as she camouflages the dark contusion beneath her eye. She internally begs her body for 2 more hours of function, just enough time to collect her wages before Marcus escalates his nightly aggression. The door swings wide to the insulated laughter of the wealthy. A waiter steps past her, completely ignoring her condition. She actually welcomes this social blindness. It reveals a grim behavioral truth. When surrounded by people who demand a flawless reality, becoming totally invisible is the absolute best survival tactic a battered mind can deploy. Arya pushes through brass doors into a dining room designed for the untouchable elite. Crystal chandeliers throw cold light across white linen, illuminating an environment heavy with careless arrogance. Patrons here process staff not as human beings, but as subservient machinery. Arya lowers her gaze, shifting into the numb rhythm of her trauma response. She steps to table 7 to deliver her rehearsed script, but the sound simply dies in her throat. The subject is not reading the menu. He is staring right through her defensive layers, dissecting her like a broken psychological puzzle. He sits perfectly still in a flawless black suit. True, predatory power always operates this way. It never needs to shout to establish dominance. It merely sits quietly, forcing everyone around it to hold their breath and submit. It is not his wealth that makes Arya's nervous system panic. It is his terrifying, absolute physical stillness. He observes her the way a forensic expert examines a crime scene. Her flight response triggers. She breathes a trembling apology and tries to retreat, but his voice anchors her in place. He flatly asks what happened to her face. Her hand flinches up to cover the contusion as she strings together a panicked lie. The stranger slowly lowers his menu. He leans forward, demanding the exact identity of her abuser. Ordinary people will gladly accept a fake narrative to avoid discomfort, but recognize a harsh psychological reality here. There is nothing more terrifying than a calculated stranger systematically exposing the violent agony you work so desperately to conceal. The moment he orders wine, Arya's instinct is sheer evasion. At the bar, her motor skills collapse. She presses her trembling hands against the wood to ground her nervous system. She is decompensating, furious that a single glance from this man breached her mental walls. The bartender slides a bottle forward, whispering that table 7 specifically requested her. Walking back to his table feels like dragging dead weight. The stranger is speaking rapid Italian into his phone, radiating the silent threat of organized violence. He cuts the call, locks onto her, and softly introduces himself as Leon. Take note of this psychological warning. When an apex predator takes a surgical interest in your trauma, your deepest biological instincts will always scream at you to turn around and run. Leon establishes dominance, noting he owns the building and gesturing to a seat. Arya perches on the edge, her body prepped for flight. He takes a calculated sip before asking how long the domestic abuse has been occurring. She recoils. She attempts a diversion, but his clinical gaze pins her in place. Her control breaks, and she asks why he even cares. The fabricated warmth drains from his face. He leans in, his tone dropping to a chilling whisper, stating he despises seeing valuable things ruined. She stands so violently the chair scrapes the floor, fleeing to the kitchen. Remember this psychological truth. Never let a narcissist objectify your suffering, turning your trauma into a mere broken possession they want to repair for their own megalomaniacal gratification. In behavioral analysis, we call this the predator's gaze. You cannot outrun a shadow cast by a man like Leon. Arya exhibits extreme hypervigilance. The weight of his observation triggers her nervous system, leaving her meal entirely untouched. Let us pause here for a second, you and I. Have you ever felt that sickening drop in your stomach when your illusion of safety vanishes? Her phone vibrates, inducing a sharp trauma response. It is Marcus. The text demands her immediate return, causing her airway to constrict with anticipated panic. She knows the violent penalty of defiance. Raising her eyes, she finds Leon standing mere feet away. He does not ask about the man waiting at home. He simply states her terror as a clinical fact. It is a calculated psychological dismantling that totally shatters her fragile defensive armor. Arya attempts to establish a boundary, her voice shaking with adrenaline as she claims he knows nothing of her environment. Leon exhibits zero emotional reactivity. He stands motionless, diagnosing her rapidly expiring time frame, and presents a thick black business card. It is a psychological anchor. He instructs her to call not if, but when. She stares at it as if it is physically dangerous. Relying on the classic denial mechanism of the abused, Leon breaches her intimate space, carrying the olfactory signature of gun oil. He plants a cognitive seed. When her denial finally shatters, his number will be her sole lifeline. Then he retreats into the dark. Sometimes, life hands a victim a strange lifeline right before a total systemic collapse. Moments later, she flees to her vehicle. Marcus is dialing repeatedly, his intoxicated, slurring, promising severe physical retribution. Gripping the wheel, Arya engages in desperate bargaining, pleading into the receiver for 10 minutes of grace. Marcus responds with a vile threat before terminating the connection. Accelerating through the wet asphalt, she experiences severe cognitive dissonance. Which pathology is more destructive? That a high-level psychopathic organizer perceived her trauma, or that her own survival instincts craved his violent protection? She parks, executing one final respiratory cycle. The unlocked door is a glaring environmental red flag. Inside, the television's sterile light illuminates Marcus beside an empty liquor bottle. He struggles upright, projecting his deep inadequacy through verbal abuse, and lunges toward her. Hear me well on this point. Committing yourself to rehabilitating a deeply disordered psychic will never cure their sickness. It will only guarantee the bitter decay of your own. The claustrophobic environment is saturated with the smell of ethanol and pathological insecurity. Marcus seizes her arm, applying enough pressure to elicit a sharp gasp of pain. You and I have examined this exact behavioral archetype before. It is a fragile, narcissistic rage generated entirely by the terror of losing dominance. He delivers a blunt force strike to her jaw. Warm blood immediately pools in her mouth. Before he can initiate a secondary assault, her ringing phone interrupts the sequence. Marcus confiscates it with a sadistic facial expression. It is her brother, Ethan. But in a paranoid mind, every external variable is a threat. He engages the speaker. Ethan's highly distressed vocalizations fill the room. Marcus responds with derisive laughter, violently displacing Arya onto the floorboards. Let me offer you a clinical absolute. Those who use violence to demand your obedience are always the ones tearing your spirit into bloody pieces. Marcus looms over his victim, displaying zero empathy as he mocks the acute panic in her brother's voice. But then the acoustic pattern on the speaker dramatically shifts. Ethan's tone descends into a flat, affectless whisper that carries the distinct psychological signature of a final farewell. He issues a hollow apology, stating he merely attempted to rectify a critical error. The subsequent dialed tone resonates like an auditory death knell. Marcus, limited by his own cognitive deficits, tosses the device aside, failing to process the lethal implications. However, a profound physiological shift occurs within Arya. She dials back, meeting only automated voicemail. As Marcus attempts restraint, she physically detaches with the raw kinetic output of a cornered animal. This is the paradox of human attachment. The threat to biological kin can instantly overwrite a victim's learned helplessness, transforming them into an absolute force of nature. In a second, she is gone. Operating under massive cortisol surges, her knuckles turn completely bloodless against the wheel. She navigates the urban decay blindly, executing a hard stop at Ethan's complex. The structural damage is immediate. The primary entry door is violently compromised, hanging off its hinges like a fractured mandible. Arya breaches the perimeter, entering an environment that registers as a localized combat zone. Splintered furniture and shattered glass contaminate the flooring. She advances through the destruction, vocalizing his name into a suffocating silence. In the sleeping quarters, the heavy mattress is entirely inverted. Pressed into the degraded wallpaper is a substantial, smeared handprint composed of coagulating arterial blood. Her motor functions instantly terminate, sending her knees crashing into the floorboards. We rationalize that we are prepared for catastrophic outcomes. But when confronted with the biological evidence of our deepest trauma, the human nervous system simply aborts the capacity to remain standing. Let us open this clinical file together. Observe the subject, Arya, her knuckles stark white against the splintered door frame. Her phone vibrates. She answers, her fine motor skills failing, only to be met by a voice that registers no elevated heart rate. It is the polished calm of a sociopathic predator. He states that her brother, Ethan, attempted to siphon $50,000 from a violent syndicate. Recognizing her financial ruin, he applies predatory coercion, suggesting she absorbed the debt through deeply personal means. Ethan is collateral in this transaction. The line disconnects. She is left gasping in a room that suddenly reeks of pure terror. It is a harsh psychological reality we must all accept. Catastrophic trauma rarely knocks. It simply breaches your perimeter and demands everything you possess. Acute trauma often fractures the mind, dropping frames of memory like a damaged film reel. When her dissociative fugue lifts, Arya stands under the neon lights of a desolate lot at 2 in the morning. Clutched in her hand is a card belonging to Leon Varley, a megalomaniacal narcissist and syndicate boss. She cannot cognitively process the violent depths of his empire. Cornered by panic, she dials. Upon hearing his steady vocal cadence, her defensive walls crumble. She weeps uncontrollably, detailing the ransom and the blood. It exposes a deeply unsettling vulnerability in the human psyche. When you are drowning at the absolute bottom of the abyss, even the most dangerous predator offering a hand can easily masquerade as your only savior. The silence on the line is a calculated tactic designed to amplify her anxiety. Leon finally speaks, his tone devoid of empathy, asking for her coordinates. He offers to sanitize the situation, but attaches a devastating psychological anchor. If he neutralizes the threat, she becomes his absolute property. It is a textbook declaration of narcissistic ownership. Yet, her cognitive load is so overwhelmed that the threat fails to register. She exhales a quiet, total surrender. 20 minutes later, an armored vehicle glides into the lot, deploying 2 operatives. They tap the glass. She unlocks the door. We must understand that sheer desperation overrides all basic survival instincts. It will consistently manipulate you into unlocking the very doors you should reinforce with solid steel. Stepping into that transport triggers a profound sensory shift, simulating the finality of a hearse. Her motor control rapidly degrades. The cabin air is saturated with the scent of expensive leather and latent hostility. They extract her from the decaying urban grid, ascending into a penthouse built on illicit capital. Behind towering glass, Leon stands motionless, exhibiting the classic grandiosity of a dark triad personality surveying his territory. With a micro-expression, he dismisses his guards. Arya remains entirely paralyzed, clutching her worn bag in a defensive posture. It highlights a bitter adaptive mechanism we all eventually recognize. Sometimes the only viable refuge in a burning environment is simply a beautifully constructed, terrifyingly expensive cage. Leon closes the distance with the measured pacing of a structured psychopath, demanding the unedited variables of her crisis. Experiencing acute vocal tremors, Arya unloads her brother's pathological gambling history. Leon absorbs this data without a single facial twitch. Then, he delivers a catastrophic cognitive shock. Ethan targeted the Volkov Syndicate, an organization that functions as the apex authority of violence in this city. Leon casually pours a spirit, calculating the morbid probability. Ethan is statistically deceased, and the Volkov fixers are now tracking her. Her baseline reality completely disintegrates. The psychological trauma is severe, but forcing your brain to accept a brutal paradigm shift is often the singular method to survive a total systemic collapse. You and I must examine the behavioral mechanics of this transaction. Leon possesses the resources to neutralize her threat, but antisocial personalities do not engage in altruism. Claiming Arya is a calculated assertion of dominance. He outlines his rigid parameters. She must accept total geographic isolation, sever all emotional attachments, and submit to his violent methodology. In exchange, he will eliminate her hunters. She stares into his deadened pupils and whispers her compliance. A faint, predatory smirk briefly alters his facial symmetry. It is a critical behavioral law to internalize. When you consciously sign a social contract with a known predator, you forfeit the psychological right to act shocked when they inevitably drag you into the deepest, darkest water. Leon escorts her to an isolation chamber disguised as a suite. The spatial dimensions are overwhelming. filled with cold marble that aggressively contrasts the cramped apartment she shared with her former partner, Marcus. She exhibits catatonic standing behavior, staring through the glass like a biological specimen. Leon notes the curated wardrobe, delivering the terminal diagnosis that her previous identity is now deceased. Her speech stutters as she inquires about Marcus. Leon merely taps his timepiece. He mandates a sleep cycle and drops a calculated verbal trigger regarding hidden surveillance before securing the heavy door. Note this carefully. Upgrading the aesthetic of your suffering does not equate to emancipation. You have merely polished the steel bars of your cell. She has traded a rust enclosure for a gilded one, and a severe panic attack predictably manifests. Stumbling into the sterile bathroom, she calibrates the water to a scalding extreme, using thermal pain to regulate her internal psychological chaos. She remains in the heat until physical exhaustion overrides her hyperarousal. Later, wrapped in foreign silk, she experiences acute insomnia. However, human neurology has hard limits. She succumbs to a heavy sleep only to be violently rebooted by the morning light. There is a microsecond of amnesic peace before the horror of her reality reasserts its dominance. It is a biological certainty. You may exhaust your nervous system, fleeing from night terrors, but the dawn will always arrive to collect the psychological debt. Her device illuminates with erratic messages from Marcus, oscillating rapidly between aggressive manipulation and desperate attachment. In a rare moment of boundary enforcement, she deletes the digital trail. An older female, Elena, enters with a prepared meal. Elena's flat effect indicates decades of complex trauma within the syndicate. When Arya asks for Leon, Elena's gaze hardens into absolute ice. Leon evacuated prior to sunrise, leaving strict directives for Arya to prepare for a high-threat evaluation. The gastrointestinal distress is immediate, rendering the food completely inedible. The neurological loop of anticipating a catastrophic event is a highly specific, agonizing torture. You must fiercely shield your cognitive baseline long before the stormfront actually breaches. Let us examine this psychological stressor together. Arya discovers garments in the wardrobe tailored to her precise biometric data, a classic control dynamic designed to induce extreme paranoia. In the common area, she encounters David Crane, the rigid specialist tasked with sanitizing the syndicate's logistical failures. He initiates the interrogation. Arya begs for proof of her brother's survival, but David's facial muscles remain entirely inert. The opposing faction is escalating hostilities, and he requires a comprehensive mapping of her brother's behavioral deficits. Here is a fundamental survival heuristic. When a cold, predatory system demands an audit of your family's mistakes, your only statistical probability of survival is absolute. Unvarnished transparency. Arya fully complies, releasing her guarded intelligence. She outlines the severe progression of her brother's pathological gambling addiction. David processes this data in silence, his keystrokes devoid of human empathy. Then Aid dispenses a lethal dose of reality. Ethan was not a civilian casualty. He was embedded as a financial courier for the rival cartel. The operational failure is catastrophic. Ethan was contracted to transport $80,000, but delivered an empty container and absconded. The cartel now demands restitution scaled to the disrespect. The pigment rapidly drains from Arya's face. Analyze this mechanism closely. The toxic secrets you conceal to protect the people you love are almost always weaponized to ensure their complete destruction. We are at the pathological nucleus of this crisis. David clinically dissects the board. The initial ransom was merely a stress test. A diagnostic, really. Leon possesses the coercive power to halt the rival syndicate, provided Arya maintains zero visibility. But a chaotic variable just corrupted the protocol. Her volatile ex, Marcus, filed a missing persons report. David's eyes flatline. He notes that Leon is rectifying the anomaly. In their violent paradigm, loose ends are not managed. They are permanently liquidated. The subtext is absolute. Marcus is slated for immediate termination. David repacks his briefcase, abandoning her to suffocate in pure horror. This is a harsh awakening. The predators you petition for sanctuary are often infinitely more lethal than the storm you run from. We begin our clinical observation in an environment designed for absolute coercive control. The subject, Arya, exhibits the physical posturing of a traumatized captive, shrinking against the sterile architecture of her captor's penthouse. The housekeeper operates as a warden enforcing the isolation protocols of a megalomaniacal narcissist. No visitors, windows mechanically sealed, egress denied by a keypad. Arya attempts a display of defiance, her voice fracturing as she denies her containment, but the warden's pitying smile dismantles this fragile defense. You and I must recognize a haunting psychological truth here. Victims frequently construct their own internal cages, locking themselves safely inside familiar trauma long before a physical key is ever turned against them. Observe her profound dissociation as she stares through the reinforced glass, functionally invisible to the city below. The silence is severed by a jarring electronic buzz. It is Leon, our primary psychopath. His vocal tone is a calibrated rumble, issuing a non-negotiable directive to be ready by 7. When her trauma response pushes her to question his motive, his reply is an exercise in absolute authoritarian control. Because I said so. Hours later, the warden presents an obsidian silk dress, an artifact deliberately chosen to highlight the subject's previous socioeconomic inferiority. It is a calculated degradation tactic. We must understand a dark behavioral truth here. Predators do not simply clothe their victims. They strategically costume them to erase their previous identity completely. The physical markers of her previous abuse are concealed beneath heavy, expensive cosmetics. Precisely at 7, the narcissist enters. His dark attire functions as a psychological dampener in the dimly lit room. He initiates a trauma-bonding sequence, allowing his clinical gaze to analyze her hyper-vigilant frame before brings targeted validation. The warmth flooding her cheeks indicates the dangerous onset of Stockholm Syndrome. He maneuvers her onto a stone terrace, orchestrating a romantic illusion that systematically tightens the psychological chains around her mind. He pours the wine with predatory grace. We must all eventually accept a heavy lesson in human pathology. The most aesthetically beautiful cages are still meticulously engineered to permanently fracture your wings. Let us examine this together. The psychopath guarantees her safety, but the assurance is clinically hollow. Displaying rare defiance, her nervous system overwhelmed, she states his word holds no value. A micro-expression of amusement crosses his features. He reveals his sociopathic calculus. Rivals are encroaching, and he requires a catalytic pawn. That pawn is her brother. When she hysterically accuses him of weaponizing her family trauma, he exhibits a flat affect, simply sipping his wine. Leverage, he states, outlining his plan to systematically suffocate his enemies. We must face a bitter truth regarding antisocial behavior. True dominance is never about initiating physical violence. It is about feeding the enemy's delusion of control until they willingly step into the abyss. The megalomaniac articulates his pathology with zero autonomic arousal. Empathy is a delusion. Survival demands apex penetration. He initiates a psychological stress test, inquiring about her previous domestic abuser. Her nervous system instantly triggers a severe panic response. Leon displays a predatory smile, confirming he has already neutralized the threat. When she expresses desperate anxiety regarding police intervention, his heart rate remains static. He dissects his meal with psychopathic precision, explaining he possesses the blackmail material necessary to ensure her former abuser's permanent silence. We are forced to swallow a bitter clinical truth. Sometimes, the only functional deterrent against an unregulated predator is an entity that is significantly more methodical and dark. The narcissist clinically deconstructs her former abuser as an opportunistic coward who collapses before an apex threat. Arya enters a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Her moral framework rejects his sociopathic methods, yet her limbic system registers an intoxicating dose of relief. Detecting this fragmentation, Leon sharply demands her ultimate psychological objective. When she defaults to her brother's safety, he bypasses her superficial defenses. He analyzes her trauma responses as valuable data points, framing her lifelong hypervigilance not as a pathology, but as a superior survival adaptation. It is a harsh truth of human behavioral science. Severe trauma frequently constructs the exact neurological armor required to endure the darkness of tomorrow. The patient questions her utility to a sociopath. Closing the physical distance, Leon explains his organization relies on absolute loyalty. In a masterclass of manipulation, he offers integration into his hierarchy, presenting a false binary choice: take the capital and flee, or remain and study the architecture of coercive control. He isolates her unique psychological variable. Unlike most victims, she never rationalized her abuser's violence. In a system built on deception, her raw honesty is a highly valuable metric. She clings to fading moral boundaries, but he dismantles them, stating his operations transcend standard criminality. It is a profound lesson of human nature. Eventually, a psychological crossroads forces the prey to decide to continue fleeing or adapt to become the predator. He instructs her to observe. When the narcissist extends his hand, her traumatized nervous system bypasses its alarm signals, compelling her to accept. The physical contact presents a cognitive paradox, radiating lethal threat while offering somatic security. The subject then deploys a psychological mirroring technique, revealing his own developmental trauma. His father was a sadistic abuser who dismantled his mother's psyche. At 12, Leon permanently severed his capacity for vulnerability. The patient is destabilized as his facade drops, exposing the fractured child who survived by studying the pathology of violent men. It is a profound behavioral truth we must remember. The most impenetrable psychological empires are constructed upon the repressed foundations of unimaginable pain. You and I have likely observed this exact clinical precipice, the critical juncture before a trauma response is rewritten. The sociopath studies his subject, analyzing the cognitive dissonance peaking in her neural pathways. Will she maintain her passive avoidance strategy or adopt his aggressive pathology? Her vocal cords constrict, a somatic manifestation of her desperation to believe her trauma is unique. But the diagnostic reality paralyzes her. The identity of the victim is the only psychological framework she understands. Her voice fractures as she requests a delay. He strategically withdraws, allowing the isolation to amplify her internal terror. We must internalize this haunting truth. The most inescapable facilities of confinement are the ones meticulously constructed within our own neurology. We document a subject depleted by post-traumatic stress, exhibiting the flat affect of severe depression. It is a physiological failure when the nervous system entirely down-regulates its capacity for hope. A digital stimulus interrupts her dissociation with a directive to be prepared by 9. She braces her skeletal structure, anticipating the apex predator. Instead, the narcissist presents a calculated visual shift, abandoning his tailored armor for casual textiles. This deliberate display of pseudo-vulnerability is clinically far more manipulative. They merge into the metropolitan flow like phantoms. The bleakest lesson of survival dictates this. A fractured psyche frequently misidentifies the suffocating grip of coercive control as the only reliable source of lasting psychological safety. Isolated within a diner, the megalomaniac orders a stimulant with a deeply suppressed resting heart rate. When the patient probes his silence, observe his repetitive motor function. Stirring a beverage with agonizing patience, he demonstrates a calculated contrast to the volatile abuser of her history. She attempts to suppress her fear response, but he catalogues the microscopic flinch in her spine. She anticipates explosive, unregulated rage. Leaning forward, he clinically explains that he is exponentially more dangerous. Her previous abuser was merely emotionally dysregulated. Leon executes destruction with cold, sociopathic intentionality. We must remember this behavioral trait. True trauma bonding is rarely built on gentle comfort. It is forged through the terrifying application of brutal, unapologetic honesty. The subject exhibits appetite loss, an indicator of elevated cortisol. The narcissist initiates a psychological extraction, inquiring about her brother's personality prior to his decompensation. In his ecosystem, weaponized vulnerability is the ultimate currency. Aria verbalizes her foundational trauma, detailing the sudden parental loss that forced her sibling into a parentified role. This chronic stress generated deep subconscious resentment. Eventually, his psyche fractured into severe substance dependency, severing their attachment bond. Functioning in total isolation, she became the perfect psychological prey for a domestic predator. It is a devastating clinical reality. Patients frequently sprint back into familiar ruin simply because the lonely silence of the healing process is far too terrifying to endure. We observe the patient's facial tension indicating severe survivor's guilt. Her distorted cognition dictates she is responsible for her sibling's decay. The psychopath surgically extracts this delusion through cognitive reframing, enforcing that her brother's failures are self-generated. He posits that excessive empathy merely programs a host to absorb the collateral damage of another's dysfunction. They arrive at a rusted industrial exterior that camouflages a high-security facility. Inside stands Simone, an operative radiating the freezing, calculated effect of a primary enforcer. You and I must extract a painful behavioral lesson here. The psychological assets we most desperately need to protect are invariably buried beneath the most shattered, abrasive exteriors. Let us examine this case file together, you and I. Leon exhibits classic dark triad traits, masking his syndicate as a simple shipping firm. His enforcer, Simone, displays deep sociopathic attachment, easily decoding the nervous dysregulation in Aria. Her trembling hands betray severe distress over her captive brother. Leon withdraws into the shadows, a calculated display of control, whispering his enemies should drown in terror. Later, in their vehicle, Aria experiences an emotional rupture, demanding to know why an apex predator would bleed for a stranger. This reveals a fundamental behavioral truth. We frequently hurl ourselves into the flames for others, driven by a desperate psychological compulsion to rescue the ghosts of our own unresolved pasts. Leon drives through the rain, clinically unearthing his formative trauma. At 15, he asphyxiated his abusive father. Observing his deadened affect, we recognize the profound dissociation that took root during the act. Abandoned by his mother, he was adopted by an uncle who instilled a purely psychopathic framework. Violence was never emotional dysregulation. It was a surgical instrument requiring a calculated return on investment. Leon studies Arya, identifying his own fractured childhood mirrored in her hypervigilant stare. As her ragged breathing regulates, we observe a vital psychological lesson. The most fiercely protective forms of empathy are rarely nurtured in safe environments. Instead, they are systematically forged within the blackest shadows of the human experience. Arya displays cognitive reframing. Relieved he avoids treating her as fragile, he clinically observes she is merely bent. Psychologically, there is a gulf between ego collapse and adaptive submission to survive trauma. Leon isolates himself, leaving Arya to battle her soaring cortisol levels. When he returns with the location, her fight-or-flight response demands participation in the rescue. Instantly, Leon's protective mask vanishes, replaced by the authoritarian rigidity of an apex predator. He enforces strict, non-negotiable boundaries. She stays. This highlights a profound psychological reality of guardianship. Those accustomed to extreme violence construct immovable walls, acting solely to guarantee the innocent remain entirely uncontaminated by the psychological rot they are about to unleash. Driven by a trauma-induced need to reclaim agency, Arya's internal conflict spikes. Observing Leon's unyielding affect, she realizes negotiation is futile and offers a hollow nod of submission. Leon's hypervigilance easily detects her deception, yet he tactically ignores it. She spends the night in acute paralysis, her nervous system completely overwhelmed. By morning, Leon reappears, his civilian persona entirely eradicated. Clad in tactical armor, he has dissociated into his primary role as an instrument of pure lethality. This underscores a harsh clinical truth we observe in extreme psychological profiles. When a situation demands absolute survival, the empathetic caregiver must be forcefully suppressed, allowing the remorseless predator to assume full executive control. Leon operates with the mechanical precision of a psychopath preparing for conflict. He issues a monotonous warning of violence, entirely detached from his words. Arya exhibits severe somatic anxiety, struggling to eat while he paces to elevate his baseline arousal. He establishes unblinking eye contact, using dominant posturing to demand absolute compliance. She must remain contained, regardless of the psychological decompensation isolation brings. When she questions the variable of his death, he offers a rigid guarantee of her brother's survival. Yet, the mathematics of trauma are highly inflexible. Complete trust requires immense cognitive resources, and a nervous system shattered by profound loss simply lacks the emotional currency needed to make that dangerous psychological investment. Arya issues a verbal surrender, yet her micro-expressions suggest defiance. Leon pauses to analyze her features, revealing a rare spark of affective empathy. He uses her as a psychological anchor before entering a violent fugue state. The door secures, initiating severe sensory deprivation. This isolation triggers massive dysregulation of Arya's nervous system, shattering her cognitive control. She watches his tactical unit deploy. Barely 20 minutes elapse before her trauma-bonded compulsion overrides his strict boundaries, driving her toward the combat zone. This highlights a fascinating clinical instinct we see in survivors. The human ego finds the creeping guilt of passive survival far more intolerable than stepping directly into the path of lethal physical danger. To breach her containment, Arya experiences severe tachycardia at the keypad, her nervous system flooded with adrenaline. This hyper-aroused state triggers rapid problem-solving. She searches the kitchen based on the behavioral assumption that older staff prefer analog memory aids to digital encryption. Her hypothesis is validated upon finding a hidden ledger with the codes. Exhibiting gross motor tremors, she inputs the sequence. The elevator descent mimics a dissociative plunge into a psychological underworld. Discovering an unsecured vehicle below reinforces a vital clinical concept. When external safety barriers suddenly collapse, the resulting exposure acts as the ultimate behavioral stress test, exposing the exact, unvarnished throat of an individual's psychological resolve. The vehicle speeds into the storm, mirroring the distress-constricting Arya's respiratory system. Stick with me, because you and I recognize the clinical pathology here. This maladaptive devotion compels a person to drive directly into a fatal hazard for a bonded subject. Abandoning the car, she uses the freezing rain as camouflage outside the warehouse. Grinding steel suddenly pierces the night. We observe Leon and Simone using brute force to extract the captive. Visual confirmation immediately triggers catastrophic cognitive dissonance in Arya. The bleeding victim is an unknown variable, not her brother. Entering a state of tonic immobility against the cold masonry, she suppresses her own breathing, straining to capture the auditory data of Leon's highly lethal interrogation tactics. The captive exhibits an illogical display of ego preservation. Leon's effect remains flat as he issues a microscopic nod. Simone, his psychopathic extension, strikes the subject's jaw with her firearm. Fracturing bone echoes in the rain, concealed. Arya covers her mouth, her amygdala hyperfiring. Witnessing clinical violence irreversibly destroys a person's psychological baseline. Leon deploys sophisticated psychological torture, calmly detailing the systematic amputation of the subject's digits, followed by a fabricated bereavement call to his spouse. This proves a pitch-black tenet of behavioral manipulation. Absolute terror is the ultimate override for human resilience. The captive's psychological defenses immediately collapse, and he frantically confesses the boy was relocated at dawn. Simone presses her boot millimeters from the subject's eye, maximizing the coercion. Broken, the subject experiences total cognitive submission, revealing the boy is with Petrov, a documented sadist. Leon stands tall, sharing a non-verbal exchange with Simone. Clinically, the most profound psychological shifts occur during these silent intervals. Leon initiates the next phase, resting a blade against the subject's carotid artery. One wrong syllable guarantees his termination. The subject makes the call. Driven purely by primal self-preservation, he fabricates a seamless deception, citing rival incursions to acquire the location. This illustrates a grim evolutionary mechanism. Betrayal becomes an effortless reflex when your own biological survival is the only remaining variable on the table. The captive's vocal tremors betray acute distress as he begs for the location. Finally, Petrov provides the coordinates. Leon immediately terminates the connection, obliterating the phone under his boot. Hoisting the informant, he extracts tactical data, confirming 6 hostiles. Leon then clinically queries the boy's physical status. The informant admits they inflicted near-lethal trauma upon Ethan during a brutal interrogation. Observing from the shadows, Arya is paralyzed by catastrophic dread. This highlights a well-documented psychological phenomenon. We rarely understand the depth of our own savage resilience until our attachment figures are subjected to extreme violence. Leon processes this new variable with a grim nod, instantly recalibrating his violent methodology to address the escalating severity. Let us open this case file together and examine the exact moment a controlled psyche collapses. We observe Leon barking frantic tactical directives into his radio. When he severs the connection, his sudden immobility is textbook psychological shock. He registers Arya standing, exposed in the freezing downpour. She has broken the primary directive of survival, lured into the open by a pathological trauma bond to her brother. Leon's carefully constructed emotional mask fragments into volcanic rage. He drags her toward the vehicle, demanding to know why she compromised the safe house. Through her tears, she cites blood ties as her only defense. Note this clinical reality well. Blind, unchecked familial devotion will inevitably drag an otherwise rational mind straight into the darkest slaughterhouse. Observe the physical manifestation of the martyr complex as Leon forces the door open, shoving her inside. He states that if she is killed tonight, his own violent sacrifices are entirely invalidated. The most bitter pill a self-appointed protector must swallow is realizing they cannot surgically control the reckless autonomy of those they defend. He violently slams the heavy door. Through the rain-slicked glass, Arya watches him engage in a severe verbal altercation with Simone, who eventually retreats into the mist. Leon takes the wheel, accelerating aggressively, without making a single point of eye contact with his passenger. We must document this painful psychological law. Weaponized silence is often the most devastating trauma a fragile human soul can ever endure. Notice how Leon attempts to re-establish dominance. His facial micro-expressions are completely suppressed in the dim lighting as he issues a rigid mandate: lock the doors and eliminate all visible presence. Arya provides a terrified affirmative. He forces a paper into her trembling hands, lowering his vocal register. If he does not return in exactly 60 minutes, she must find Marcus. Panic floods her nervous system, but he raises a hand, demanding compliance. Then, we witness his clinical detachment fracture as his knuckles briefly brush her wet cheek. Understand this behavioral reality. Even the most impenetrable emotional armor will inevitably dissolve against the one attachment figure you truly value. He commits to returning, fading into the storm. For 20 minutes, that isolated vehicle functions as a sensory deprivation chamber of pure psychological torture. The rain violently assaults the roof, serving as constant auditory overstimulation. Suddenly, a solitary gunshot fractures the environment. Arya experiences an acute respiratory pause. A chaotic eruption of automatic fire and human distress echoes from the compound. Her biological fight response urges her to sprint toward the violence. But Leon's final authoritative command anchors her physically to the seat. We must identify this brutal lesson of human conditioning. Maintaining a passive state of obedience during intense trauma is infinitely more agonizing than recklessly charging into the flames. A sudden cessation of noise is obliterated by an explosion. Then, the cellular device in her pocket vibrates. She answers with severe motor tremors. A highly regulated, aristocratic male voice smoothly greets her by name, calmly initiating their inevitable psychological engagement. We focus on Arya's features, distorted by terror as she demands his identity. The caller introduces himself as Alexei Volkov, casually weaponizing the fact that her brother is bleeding beside him. Note the severe psychopathic traits at play. Volkov maintains a monstrously polite baseline, proposing an exchange of her life for his. Pay close attention to this clinical reality. True apex predators always camouflage their most depraved atrocities within the framework of a reasonable negotiation. Arya demands empirical proof. A physical impact transmits through the receiver, followed by Ethan's shattered voice begging her to flee. Volkov reclaims the device, dictating a location on Industrial Boulevard. She has 30 minutes before Ethan expires. As more gunfire erupts from Leon's coordinates, Arya accepts the absolute collapse of her situational control. The crushing weight of cognitive dissonance finally breaks her paralysis. Leon is engaged in a violent conflict she catalyzed. If she remains passive, her brother faces certain mortality. Her shaking hands engage the ignition, shifting her neurochemistry from pure panic into a state of glacial, hyper-focused action. The clock displays 22 minutes. She navigates the flooded infrastructure, risking her existence for a sibling whose destructive patterns mirror hers. Industrial Boulevard emerges from the fog like a graveyard of oxidized steel. She terminates the headlights near the designated unit as the massive doors disengage. Her amygdala screams at her to flee this obvious trap. But you and I must recognize the cruelest law of human attachment. True loyalty is inherently unstable. It is the agonizing willingness to march directly into a physical and psychological inferno for your kin. She steps into the void. Every individual operates under psychological debt, but familial ledgers are balanced with pieces of the psyche itself. We observe Arya entering the facility. Blinding lights illuminate Alexei Volkov. His immaculate presentation and superficial charm perfectly mask an entirely hollow emotional core. He offers a polite greeting. Arya's focus tunnels exclusively onto the brutalized figure in the corner. Ethan has suffered severe physical trauma. He attempts a verbal warning before an enforcer applies crushing pressure to his ribs. Arya exhibits a violent nervous system response, lunging forward with a scream. Volkov raises one finger. Instantly pausing the aggression, he circles her, feeding on her dysregulation. Understand this grim diagnostic truth. Empathy is merely a fatal liability to the antisocial mind. The trap closes as he demands the tactical intelligence required to eliminate Leon. Let us review this clinical interaction together. We observe Volkov pacing the concrete, using echoing footsteps to amplify environmental intimidation. He systematically dismantles Arya's reality. Her brother's financial deficit is irrelevant. To a megalomaniacal narcissist, capital is meaningless, but emotional extortion provides absolute control. Arya is simply a psychological instrument designed to fracture a rival. She insists, with severe vocal tremors, that Leon possesses no attachment to her. Volkov issues a humorless laugh, exposing the devastating reality. Leon is dismantling his own empire to ensure her survival. The most agonizing developmental milestone we reach is discovering our true value to another human being only when the cost is measured in absolute ruin. At Volkov's signal, the iron doors open and enforcers drag the bleeding form of Leon into the harsh light. Examine the physiological state of our subject, Leon. He struggles with equilibrium, his arm displaying a severe structural deviation. Upon establishing visual contact with Arya, his defensive compartmentalization collapses. We detect no aggressive posturing, only profound, unmitigated grief. He labels her a foolish girl, his voice strained by suppressed emotion. Volkov observes from the periphery, verbally dissecting the vulnerability, ruining them. The sociopath outlines his extortion parameters. Leon must relinquish geographic dominance, restore supply chains, and transfer $200,000. When Leon inquires about the penalty for non-compliance, Volkov applies a firearm to Arya's cranium. Observe Leon processing this devastating moral calculus. True devotion manifests in the terrifying readiness to accept total self-destruction so your attachment figure might survive. He calmly offers his own life in exchange. Volkov denies the altruistic substitution, yet the displaced alpha asserts a final mechanism of control. Leon's vocal tone regains its rigid authority, establishing a contingency of mutually assured destruction. If they expire, a data cache reaches federal authorities in 30 minutes. Volkov projects a forced smile, attempting to classify the threat as a bluff. The environment drops to silence, punctuated only by the storm. Leon maintains unbroken eye contact, daring the narcissist to test the hypothesis. A micro-expression of genuine apprehension ripples across Volkov's features. The weapon subtly drifts from Arya's temple. Volkov argues that this exposure would annihilate Leon's operation as well. But Leon has already integrated his own demise. Note this psychological absolute. The most impenetrable mental fortitude stems from entirely accepting your own obliteration before the conflict even initiates. Leon is prepared to burn. Volkov is not. Analyze the dynamics of this conclusion. The environment is saturated with the scent of oxidized blood. Leon grounds himself with a total absence of nervous system arousal. Volkov directs the firearm at his face, from prolonged institutional decay. Leon maintains a flattened affect, displaying zero panic. He issues a final directive for Ethan to secure his sibling and initiate a permanent withdrawal. Listen, you and I must recognize this clinical paradox. Sometimes, the most profound manifestation of attachment is finding the devastating cognitive fortitude to sever the bond entirely so the other may survive. Arya processes the trauma of Leon's bleeding features, her emotional stability fragmenting. She vocalizes an irrational promise to return. Leon responds with a faint, melancholic micro-expression. He understands the fixed parameter of this intervention. Her integration into this hostile environment is permanently terminated. We observe the physiological aftermath of severe trauma as Ethan's motor functions entirely collapse on the flooded asphalt. They achieve minimal distance before acute exhaustion pulls them into the water. The environment remains hostile, yet Arya's survival drive overrides her depletion. She vocalizes his name with maximum output, using auditory stimulation to combat his declining consciousness. Document this fascinating biological imperative. It is frequently within our most shattered, neurologically depleted that raw evolutionary resilience activates. Bypassing her own muscular failure, she forces his dead weight into the vehicle and collapses into the operator's position. Experiencing severe adrenaline tremors, she inputs the coordinates from Leon's saturated card. 12 minutes remain. She engages the transmission, accelerating erratically, her psyche permanently altered by the trauma she is desperately fleeing. Let us examine the psychological fallout. In the dashboard's glow, Ethan spirals into severe physiological collapse. His chest heaves while Arya exhibits acute traumatic panic, muttering frantic prayers to tether him to consciousness. The vehicle screeches before a brutal brick structure. She hammers the glass until Marcus emerges, a man fundamentally carved by systemic violence. She screams that Leon sent her, that the megalomaniac narcissist, Volkov, Gemini, you and I must acknowledge a profound truth here. Our greatest salvation often arrives wrapped in the most terrifying packages. Marcus checks Ethan's thready pulse in a heartbeat. He registers the girl's presence, but notes the alpha is missing. The entire behavioral matrix has utterly collapsed. The connections severs with a heavy click, echoing off wet brick. Marcus clinically studies Aria's trembling frame before pulling her inside. He transports Ethan like a broken anatomical model into a harsh, fluorescent room reeking of cold bleach and buried psychological secrets. A surgeon begins slicing away ruined garments without a single word. Aria remains locked in a dissociative stupor, anchored by the suffocating pathology of survivor's guilt. When Marcus demands the truth, her voice fractures. She confesses the warehouse trap. The brutal reality sets in. Leon traded his own existence to buy hers. We make desperate behavioral wagers in the pitch black, praying to find a sliver of light, only to watch the darkness swallow our psychological defenses entirely. Tears cut through the physical grime on Aria's face as she begs for a rescue intervention. Marcus demonstrates a profound blunted affect, remaining a statue of cold indifference with his eyes locked on the security feeds. He states, completely devoid of empathy, that they do not mount rescue missions. Her traumatic hyperarousal spikes, demanding to know the prognosis if Volkov simply executes him. Marcus finally turns that, he murmurs, would ignite a war that burns this city to ash. The episodic memory flashes in her cortex. Leon in that warehouse studying her face as if imprinting it permanently. Marcus demands total behavioral compliance. The dead hours of night are a profound cognitive torture, forcing us to sit still and analyze the ghosts of our disastrous errors. Aria sits paralyzed in the harsh glare of the clinical theater, observing the doctor with detached dissociation. A subject named Elena materializes from the corridor, dropping clean garments onto Aria's lap without a sound. Aria changes in a hollow fugue state, crushed beneath the cognitive weight of her own ruin. Elena leans against the doorframe, projecting absolute psychological certainty. She claims Leon has danced with mortality for 15 years and never missed a step. But Aria understands the underlying pathology. He stumbled because he made a conscious choice to catch her. True emotional vulnerability reveals itself only when we drop our iron defenses, knowing full well the devastating trauma that may follow. Right at midnight, the surgeon wipes his hands. Ethan will survive. The medical prognosis hits Aria with kinetic force, snapping the somatic tension in her spine until her knees impact the floor. This sudden drop in cortisol drags her into a comatose sleep, but the neurological peace is brief. She jolts awake to find David Crane looming over her. The operative looks entirely depleted. It is 4 a.m. He drags her into a claustrophobic space and unleashes his suppressed rage, asking if she grasps that she incinerated months of undercover work. She bites back, rationalizing she only wanted to save her brother. It is a cruel irony of the human condition. Our most noble biological instincts often bring catastrophic ruin down upon those fighting to keep us safe. David stares right through her, stating coldly she forced Leon into a fatal maneuver. The tension in the cramped office grows dense enough to suffocate. David drives his fist into the desk, an explosive failure of impulse control that rings out like a gunshot. He radiates fury that Leon broke operational protocol by refusing to abandon her. Yet, you and I know the clinical truth. Leon analyzed her and recognized a fragile piece of humanity his psyche could not discard. When Aria whispers a plea for data, her posture demonstrates total depressive collapse. David sags, exhaling a defeated breath. Total radio silence. The megalomaniac Volkov is keeping Leon isolated, stress testing his bluff. It forces us toward a bitter diagnostic reality. A whispered apology can never rebuild the psychological house we burn down when we shatter the very rules of survival. David clinically dissects her under the dim lighting, silently measuring whether she possesses the psychological resilience required for the next act. In this antisocial underworld, he warns, letting your empathetic circuits engage is identical to handing a loaded weapon to your executioner. He slides a dossier of surveillance data across the wood. 18 months they have tracked Volkov, yet remain paralyzed without the proof inside his vault. Arya asks where she fits into this violent psychodrama. David delivers the clinical verdict. Volkov will summon her soon. Let us be clear about the gravity here. Sometimes, the only way to eradicate a malignant narcissist is to walk directly into his manufactured reality, step willingly into the trap, and pry the jaws open from within. The directive hangs in the air like a heavy cognitive load. David needs her to wear a transmitter. Arya goes rigid. A classic nervous system freeze response flooding her veins. They want her to manipulate the exact psychopath who nearly slaughtered her family. David pushes forward. It is the only way to dismantle Volkov. The subject's bloated narcissistic grandiosity blinds him to the capability of his victims. His ego will never compute the deception. A trauma flashback pierces her cortex. The glint of steel, Leon's blood on the tiles, it tips the behavioral scales. She accepts the assignment. Alone, she buries her face in trembling hands. She has spent a lifetime in flight mode, but you cannot outrun the darkness indefinitely. Eventually, you must plant your feet and fight the shadows. It is a textbook case of extreme risk-taking, yet it remains her only path to neutralize the devastation she caused. At 6, Marcus fills the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of blunted emotion. Volkov has transmitted a message. He is discarding Leon at Pier 17 in 2 hours. Arya vaults from her chair, her heart rate spiking into severe tachycardia. Pier 17, the precise geographical trigger where this trauma loop began. Marcus orders her to remain stationary, calculating the high probability of a fatal ambush. She cuts him off. Leon mortgaged his own biology to buy hers. Avoidance is no longer viable. They deploy together, parking near the fog-choked docks. The most grueling symptom of impending violence is the suffocating anticipatory anxiety just before the hammer crashes down. 30 minutes bleed away before a sedan pierces the fog. 2 enforcers discard a physically shattered subject onto the concrete. It is Leon. The visual data highlights severe blunt force trauma, his arm in a bloody sling, his face marked by deep emedomas. Marcus initiates tactical response, but Arya experiences a total collapse of impulse control. Sprinting into the open, Leon processes her presence through swollen eyes, reminding her of his directive to stay away. She kneels in the rain, aggressively rejecting his authority. Look, you and I understand this behavioral paradox. We isolate ourselves to manage crushing psychological pain, fighting off the very attachments desperate to anchor us. Leon only manages to verify Ethan's vital signs before his neurological systems shut down entirely, slipping into the dark. In the subterranean clinic, the surgeon forces Leon's dislocated joint into its socket with a sickening crack. Leon metabolizes the somatic agony without a single micro-expression, radiating dangerous hyper-vigilance. Once stabilized, he corners Arya, delivering a strict mandate: extract Ethan and vanish before Volkov concludes his violent loop. But Arya refuses to yield. She exhibits a profound trauma bond, entirely aware he gambled his mortality for hers. Leon attempts to construct a psychological fortress, coldly intellectualizing his sacrifice as a purely tactical maneuver to strip away emotional variables. It is a highly transparent defense mechanism. Some cognitive lies are so hopelessly fragile. They shatter the second they leave a subject's lips, exposing the bleeding emotional core they are trying so desperately to conceal. Picture the clinical environment bathed in the sterile yellow of a single bulb. She verbally dismantles his cognitive dissonance, her voice a mere whisper. She observed the acute amygdala hijack, the raw panic. In his micro-expressions, under her sustained analysis, Leon's psychological defenses finally collapse. He confesses a terrifying pathology. When her survival is threatened, his empathy shuts down, transforming him into an apex predator. Arya slowly descends to her knees, staring into the dark abyss of his psyche. She demands he condition her to systematically destroy the narcissist, Volkov. She is terminating her role as the passive victim. He reaches out, a trembling hand grazing her cheek, warning her neurology is not wired for this toxic underworld. She holds firm. It is a vital behavioral reminder. True psychological resilience only solidifies when we willingly step into the roaring flames. Let us examine this behavioral shift together. Because the psychological stakes have reached terminal velocity, Leon finally yields, but establishes absolute boundaries, a classic trauma response. He registers a blood oath to reduce Volkov's syndicate to ash if a single hand touches her. Over 7 grueling days, Arya undergoes a brutal conditioning phase. David trains her fine motor skills to conceal a wire, while Marcus drills pure survival into her neural pathways. Down the hall, Ethan slowly mends, but the silence between them is thick enough to suffocate. It highlights a tragic irony in human behavior. We spend our lives constructing towering emotional walls to protect the ones we love, entirely forgetting that those very same walls leave us locked alone in the dark. Ethan remains isolated in his shadowed room, drowning in a suffocating guilt that no therapy could easily unpack. Then, the ultimate stressor materializes. A blocked number illuminates the screen, and the voice belongs to the architect of their psychological ruin, Volkov. The crime lord speaks with a rhythm dripping in manufactured warmth, a textbook tactic of the megalomaniac narcissist, even offering a hollow apology. He demands her presence for dinner at the Monarch, the glittering crown jewel of the city. When she questions the trap, he dangles the ultimate salvation, erasing her brother's debt entirely. It reveals a terrifying flaw in human nature. The deadliest traps set for us are always beautifully wrapped in the comforting illusion of a completely clean slate. Volkov insists they process the Varelli situation, prompting Leon to signal Arya to keep the psychopath engaged. Volkov spins a masterful performance, faking sorrow over Leon's violent pathology and offering her a way out. The man practically bleeds weaponized empathy through the receiver. Every survival instinct screams at her to disconnect, but she observes the dark bruises on Leon's exhausted face. Her vocal cords tremble, yet she agrees to meet him at 8 the next night. The second the line goes dead, violent physiological tremors rack her frame. Leon quietly begs her to walk away, but she anchors her feet, clinically speaking. Sometimes stepping willingly into a roaring fire is the only way to burn away the demons holding you hostage. Stick with me here, because the psychological tension in this room is reaching a critical threshold. Arya locks eyes with Leon, declaring she is permanently done functioning as prey, a total rejection of learned helplessness. Leon offers a slow, heavy nod, He swears he will be embedded inside that restaurant, ready to burn the building down if her safety is compromised. The next 24 hours bleed into an exhausting montage of behavioral conditioning. Marcus secures a microscopic wire to her skin, drilling escape routes until she is numb. Leon instructs her to project total vulnerability to feed Volkov's massive ego. The clinical lesson cuts deep. Real courage is not the absence of terror, but rather staring your worst nightmare directly in the eyes and refusing to blink. Leon carefully manipulates her physical baseline, coaching her posture to project pure terror, perfectly calibrating her breathing to stroke Volkov's pathological ego. By 8 o'clock, Arya feels she has aged a lifetime. She slips into a dark dress, painfully aware of the freezing metal wire taped against her ribs. Pushing through the doors of the Monarch feels like stepping into a gilded behavioral cage. She spots Volkov at a shadowed table, wearing the patient, hollow grin of an apex predator. She forces a fragile smile, her eyes scanning the wealthy crowd. She cannot visually confirm Leon's presence, yet she feels the heavy weight of his protective fixation. It reveals a quiet truth. Sometimes, true devotion is simply knowing someone is standing right there in the shadows while you walk into the flames. We observe the table as the kingpin smoothly orders red wine, expertly maintaining the charade of a normal social interaction. Arya hits her behavioral markers flawlessly. She offers a hollow laugh, her fingers exhibiting a visible tremor, while the cold wire catches every shallow breath. The shadows deepen as Volkov leans into her personal space. His voice drops to a venomous whisper, clinically devaluing Leon as a sociopath who only discards people. Then comes the primary manipulation. He slides a crisp envelope across the wood, a promise to erase her brother's ruin if she simply betrays her protector. You and I must always remain deeply suspicious of those who offer sudden salvation in exchange for blind loyalty. Usually, they are simply fitting you for a much heavier set of chains. Let us look closely at this scene, because the psychological atmosphere just dropped to freezing. Arya registers severe tachycardia, her pulse hammering against her ribs, swallowing hard. She asks what happens if she refuses compliance. Volkov maintains his pleasant facial symmetry, but his eyes turn to cold, dead glass. The classic psychopathic stare. He smoothly mentions he could no longer guarantee her safety. It is a death sentence tied in a silk bow. She stammers a plea for time, her motor functions barely holding her upright as she escapes. Safe inside her locked car, a text from Leon illuminates the dark cabin, telling her to come home. It reminds us that home is rarely just a physical structure. More often than not, it is simply the one person waiting patiently for you in the dark. That single directive strikes to her core. Back at the penthouse, the room hums with manic energy. David isolates the clean audio, securing a massive tactical advantage. They finally possess hard evidence of a megalomaniac crime boss. Leon crosses the floor, ignoring his bruised ribs, and pulls her into a fiercely protective embrace, whispering that her exposure to this stressor is over. But Arya initiates a fascinating behavioral shift. She steps back, breaking his hold. She has spent her life confined to quiet cages, treated like fragile glass. Now she has tasted her own autonomy. Looking him dead in the eye, she declares she is staying in the fight because once an individual finally discovers their genuine inner resilience, they can never be forced back into the dark. The next 3 weeks unfold as a highly calculated psychological operation. 4 interactions with a sociopath. Each meeting is a masterpiece of baseline manipulation. David processes the audio, while Leon remains completely out of sight. Arya leans flawlessly into the persona of the terrified victim, and Volkov validates every fabricated tear. The narcissist grows arrogant, bleeding syndicate secrets. But the illusion violently shatters during their fifth communication. We observe Arya's sudden pallor as Volkov drops a devastating variable. He possesses proof of Leon's violent history, demanding she visit his private estate tonight alone. It is a harsh clinical reality that the heavy secrets we bury to protect our loved ones are often the precise weapons used to tear them apart. The connection terminates, leaving Volkov's chilling threat hanging in the room. Arya stands paralyzed, the screen illuminating her fixed expression. Logically, this creates the exact diversion David needs to infiltrate Volkov's compound. But instead of compartmentalizing the data, she marches into Leon's study and discloses everything. Leon experiences an acute stress reaction, pacing like a caged animal. He accurately diagnoses it as a fatal trap. Volkov's estate is fortified and the probability of rescue is zero. Yet Arya refuses to yield, driven by a compulsion to unearth his repressed history. Sometimes, our frantic psychological need to resolve cognitive dissonance and find hidden truths makes us entirely blind to the blazing inferno we are willingly walking right into. Let us observe this standoff together. The psychological weight is crushing. Leon desperately outlines the probability of failure, noting Volkov has eliminated subjects for less. Arya remains emotionally impenetrable. Her vocal effect is chillingly flat as she promises the wire will document everything. Leon whispers that her new behavioral profile is completely unrecognizable. The clinical reality is profound psychological rewiring only occurs when life shoves us against our breaking point. She breaches his personal space, reminding him he programmed her to fight. Leon grips the desk, knuckles bone white. Wrecked by trauma, he confesses that losing her would induce an unrecoverable collapse. She simply demands the one variable he is terrified to provide: absolute trust. Leon closes his eyes, offering a resigned nod that locks their trajectory. He dictates strict parameters, demanding absolute compliance. The next 12 hours blurs into a stressful conditioning loop. David drills the fabricated narrative until the deception becomes involuntary muscle memory. Marcus whispers the vulnerabilities of window latches. Leon paces like a hyper-vigilant protector. By 8:30, Arya evaluates her reflection. The hidden wire presses against her ribs like ice. She projects an aura of authority, even as autonomic terror constricts her throat. It is a vital clinical lesson. Fear is never the enemy of bravery. It is simply the biological soil where genuine courage takes root. Leon steps into the frame, 30. He pulls the door shut, drowning the room in silence. The deterioration of Leon's psychological armor is fascinating to observe. He leans close, his voice a primal threat, vowing to dismantle an entire syndicate if the rival boss touches her. Arya attempts a fragile, placating smile. Leon silences her, his rough fingers tracing her jawline. He confesses her survival now supersedes his obsessive revenge. You and I have seen this before. In an environment governed by absolute violence, choosing human connection is the ultimate psychological rebellion. Arya leans into his hand, seeking the warmth of her captor in a textbook display of trauma bonding. They collide in a desperate, terrified kiss. At 8:50, she slides into the dark sedan, stepping out into the night entirely alone. The surveillance earpiece rests against her skin like a heavy physical weight. Through the static, Leon's voice serves as a psychological anchor, keeping her nervous system from a complete collapse. They arrive at Volkov's corporate headquarters. Let us pause and examine spaces like this together. These towering monuments of wealth are often just pristine masks constructed to conceal the deep psychological rot festering underneath. Arya rides the elevator up, her pulse accelerating into panic. The doors open to a cold, shadowy office. Volkov stands by the window, projecting the absolute calm of an apex predator. She demands the evidence. He points to a leather chair, ensuring she is comfortably seated before slowly sliding a dark folder across polished mahogany desk. Volkov leans forward to deliver the psychological kill shot. Smoothly stating this folder holds the reality Leon has kept buried. Arya opens it, and her respiratory rate plummets. Inside sits a meticulous archive of betrayal. Grainy photographs, financial ledgers, and documents bearing Leon's undeniable signature. Volkov coats his tone in calculated sympathy, dropping a fatal revelation. Leon has been a federal informant for 6 months. Her rescue was merely orchestrated theater to use her as bait. The most dangerous manipulations are terrifying because they weave just enough truth to make a victim question their own sanity. Her vision blurs over the ink. Volkov insists Leon is turning her into a disposable asset, promising that he alone can offer her permanent, lasting safety. Through the wire, Leon's emotional regulations shatters entirely. His panicked voice insists the files are a fabricated trap, but behavioral science tells us how the mind operates under severe stress. Once a seed of doubt takes root, a victim begins viewing their most cherished memories as clinical warning signs. Ari's brain frantically dissects every interaction. Was every display of affection just a calculated move by a narcissistic manipulator? She demands irrefutable proof. Volkov offers a cold, practiced smirk. He unlocks a heavy steel safe and extracts a flash drive, dropping his voice to a hypnotic, soothing cadence. Her fingers shake violently as she takes the metal. Volkov steps back into the shadows, revealing that the drive contains unseen footage of her brother. Volkov's eyes drain of all empathy as he expertly twists the psychological knife. He reveals Leon possessed the warehouse coordinates from the very beginning. He deliberately allowed those operatives to torture Ethan for 2 days, engineering a scenario where a traumatized Arya would blindly bond with her supposed savior. A freezing wave of cognitive dissonance washes over her. She begs him to be lying. Volkov simply invites her to watch the tape. We learn a terrible lesson in studying the criminal mind. The most devastating betrayals never arrive holding a weapon. They come with warm, open arms from the exact people you trust the absolute most. Leon is screaming through her earpiece, but her mental foundation is completely fractured. She retreats into the sterile safety of the elevator. Out on the desolate pavement, the flash drive burns in her pocket like a live explosive. She finds Leon pacing erratically near their sedan. When he demands a tactical report, she holds out the drive. Her voice is a shaking blade, accusing him of allowing Ethan's torture to guarantee her psychological dependence. I want you to picture the exact moment a megalomaniac loses control of their narrative. Leon's face drains of all human warmth, settling into a vacant, cold mask. Her reality completely dissolves. It is a terrible truth of human behavior. Sometimes, the hands pulling you from the fire are the very ones that struck the match. She asks if he knew about the raid. He delivers a chilling, clinical admission. He knew 6 hours in advance, but the tactical timing was deemed flawed. Leon refuses to yield any moral ground. He meets her devastated stare with empty eyes, categorizing his choices as a necessary operational burden. She asks if sacrificing her brother was a calculated trigger to keep her tethered. His defense is chillingly clinical. He argues Ethan brought the trauma upon himself, and intervening sooner would have jeopardized his own men. A broken laugh escapes her. She sees his pathology clearly now. Leon perfectly cloaks his predatory monstrosity in righteous logic, but running from a shattered mirror never repairs the glass. Resigned, she drops the drive into his hand. Back at the penthouse, the atmosphere is suffocating. David loads the file, and a digital graveyard of secrets finally steps into the blinding, unforgiving light. The focus shifts to Arya, capturing the precise neurological second her reality completely shatters. We all recognize that sickening physiological drop when solid ground simply vanishes beneath our feet. David leans into the monitor's glare, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The files are authenticated. For 8 long months, this entire war was a staged behavioral experiment to destroy Volkov, utilizing Arya as a blind, disposable pawn. Leon steps from the shadows, chillingly relaxed as he openly admits his manipulation. She stares at the man who allegedly saved her, finally seeing the cold strings of the psychopath. The footage stutters to life, revealing Ethan bound and bloodied. The most permanent scars are left by those who look at a trusting human heart and see only a tool. The screen flickers, throwing digital shadows across Arya's face as a guard delivers sickening blunt force trauma to Ethan. The video jumps forward. Ethan hangs slumped in his restraints. Then, a familiar silhouette bleeds into the frame. Leon. All oxygen vanishes from Arya's lungs. On the monitor, Leon crouches, checking the boy's pulse with the pure detachment of a mortician. Ethan's bruised face tilts up, silently begging for intervention. But Leon slowly shakes his head and retreats into the blackness. In the room, Arya completely shatters, screaming for justification. Leon stands rigid, claiming he only scouted the location to ensure the boy's viability. This leaves us with a devastating truth. The most crushing guilt comes from the cold mathematics we perform just to survive. Let us piece this psychological puzzle together, you and I. Arya stands paralyzed, her eyes locked on Leon's remorseless face. He constructed a labyrinth of deception, feeding her measured doses of dopamine and fear. Yet, his merciless strategy is the biological reason she is still breathing. Drawing a shaking breath, she tells David to let the drive finish. The final video is a grim insurance policy. Grainy footage captures Volkov speaking quietly with a stranger before calmly raising a weapon and executing the man with 3 quick shots. The date perfectly matches the unsolved murder of a key federal witness, an absolute checkmate. Every corrupt empire built on violence will eventually forge the very weapon required to burn its own crumbling kingdom entirely to ash. Marcus exhales a heavy breath into the quiet room. The drive was Volkov's fail-safe mechanism, a poisoned apple handed straight to his victim. When David questions the behavioral logic, Arya exposes the dark psychology at play. The boss gambled on her viewing Leon as the ultimate betrayer, hoping a traumatized mind would flee back to the familiar devil she knew. Leon steps closer, a rare micro-expression of vulnerability cracking his marble facade. He asks whose side she will take. Arya silently studies this walking clinical contradiction, a ruthless captor and a flawed savior. Meeting Leon's demanding gaze, she firmly declares she is choosing her own survival. It teaches a vital truth. True power is found the exact second you refuse to remain a pawn on someone else's board. The recording wire hits the glass table with a sharp, definitive clatter. In that echoing sound, Arya violently sheds her psychological conditioning. The lighting casts long shadows as she swears to hand David the files to legally bury Volkov. but she establishes a rigid boundary. Once the blood is spilled, she walks away entirely. She locks onto Leon, forcing the megalomaniac to finally perceive her as an equal threat. The resulting silence is utterly suffocating. David finally clears his throat, muttering they have enough evidence to end this tonight. Leon barely blinks, entirely mesmerized by the sheer defiance in her posture. When David suggests protective custody, Leon's voice cuts the room like a blade. She stays with him. You have to aggressively draw the boundaries around your own life, or someone else will inevitably cross them. Let us open the case file and examine the pathology of this exact moment. David recognizes the lethal apex of Leon's behavioral pattern and wisely withdraws, leaving the two subjects isolated above the city. Leon approaches, his vocal tremors betraying a temporary collapse of his psychopathic control. He states he could have died, yet Arya exhibits zero startle response. She articulates a textbook exposure therapy, stepping into the psychological fire to eradicate her phobic responses to both Volkov and Leon. The mobster's rigid, sociopathic mask fractures. He pours scotch, a grounding ritual, murmuring that her actions were mere survival, not bravery. They drink. It forces us to ask a clinical question. How often do we misdiagnose raw limbic desperation as noble courage? You and I have studied this dynamic in countless criminal profiles. The wealthy psychopath traditionally isolates the traumatized victim in a gilded cage. But Leon actively subverts this clinical expectation. Swirling his glass, he predicts federal intervention for Volkov, then offers her an entirely different pathology. He offers her the syndicate. He requires her acute, hyper-vigilant cognition to sustain his empire. His hands rest flat, a rare, non-verbal display of total vulnerability. Arya scans his micro-expressions for predatory manipulation, finding only an unsettling, radical transparency. She whispers her consideration. They observe the neon horizon together. We learn a foundational psychological truth here. True cognitive equilibrium never comes from avoiding the trauma. It only arrives when we finish fighting our internal wars. Exhibiting severe physiological signs of an adrenaline crash, Arya State needs to check on Ethan. Leon closes the physical distance, moving with predatory grace. He assures her the sibling is comatose. Fascinatingly, the megalomaniac narcissist lets his psychological armor disintegrate completely. His voice fractures, confessing the sheer magnitude of his terror. His trembling fingers trace her contusions, a tactile confirmation of her survival. Witnessing her in jeopardy broke his emotional suppression. Arya delivers a melancholic smile, warning that her proximity guarantees systemic chaos. He demands she stay regardless. Their slow kiss serves as an anchoring mechanism to their shared trauma. It highlights a deeply human behavioral quirk. Even in the absolute depths of emotional winter, the human brain will desperately wire itself to a reason to endure. Displaying extreme pallor, Arya verbalizes her lingering hostility. The cognitive dissonance of being utilized as a pawn in his violent ecosystem burns within her cortex. Leon absorbs the verbal strike with a slow nod, accepting the consequence of his manipulation. By dawn, federal agents systematically dismantle Volkov's infrastructure. Observing from the penthouse, Arya watches the untouchable predator reduced to a compliant, pathetic subject in police custody. She touches the glass, validating the bloodshed. Leon remains in the periphery, guarding an untreated fracture he refuses to contextualize. Months later, she testifies in a sterile judicial setting, meticulously dissecting her trauma for 12 jurors. It is a grueling psychiatric process to witness, yet It proves that the only method to eradicate a neurosis is to expose it to the merciless light of reality. Here is where you and I must separate cinematic fiction from clinical reality. The jury requires as a mere 4 hours to permanently institutionalize Volkov, yet Arya experiences no dopamine release. A profound anhedonia, a total absence of feeling, hollows out her chest. Marcus delivers a fragmented apology before vanishing from her behavioral loop entirely. Then we analyze Ethan. He endures an 8-week residential psychiatric program funded by Leon. The subject who emerges is permanently altered, his affect blunted by the survivor guilt of his freeze response during the ballistic exchange. Arya meets his gaze with profound, quiet grief. She provides no artificial closure, merely a somber nod of recognition. True psychological survival is never a sanitized triumph. It is, almost always, a brutally messy toll, extracted directly from the nervous system. Her vocal tone completely lacks moral judgment. She articulates to Ethan that both subjects were drowning in trauma, yet successfully navigated to the shoreline. Ethan retreats into a normalized societal role, their periodic communication serving to slowly reconstruct their ruptured attachment. Arya, however, actively chooses the pathology of the underworld. She assumes control of the syndicate's logistics. Her trauma-induced hypervigilance translates into an exceptional capacity to assess threat levels in any environment. Leon observes her behavioral escalation. They engage in volatile domestic conflicts, debating the rigid boundary between paternalistic protection and autonomous control. Yet, she is finally permitted the agency to fail. We observe a harsh psychological rule here. Authentic interpersonal trust is never established in states of comfort. It must be forged under immense destabilizing pressure. A temporal shift of 6 months occurs. It is past midnight, the only illumination radiating from a brass fixture on the mahogany desk. Arya traces her finger down a stack of illicit contracts, exhibiting a predatory focus as she hunts for exploitative clauses. Leon observes from the darkness, analyzing her intense cognitive flow. He murmurs, noting with clinical amusement that she actively derives serotonin from the inherent violence of this ecosystem. Arya displays no defensive posturing or shame. Her face obscured by shadow, she questions the legal morality of holding power. Leon steps forward. The terrified girl suffering from acute stress is entirely eradicated. A masterful architect of systemic control now occupies her chair. He admits he merely unlocked the cage. She destroyed it. The lesson is clinical. Genuine authority is never gifted. It must be ruthlessly seized. We are witnessing a critical shift in their coded dependency. She closes her eyes, leaning into his tactile reassurance. The toxic, cyclical game of savior and victim has been entirely extinguished from their dynamic. She regulates her breathing, inquiring about their next logistical phase. Leon details a vision of a highly lethal, symbiotic partnership. They will restructure this criminal enterprise in tandem. She initiates physical contact, the kiss demonstrating a slow, calculated finality. This is no longer the frantic trauma bonding of their initial encounters. This is a massive, deliberate, cognitive choice. The untouchable narcissist finally dismantles his own defenses, confessing his attachment. He asks her to convert his fortified isolation into a functional habitat. It shatters the romantic illusion. Enduring connection is simply two to severely traumatized subjects choosing to cease their avoidance behaviors. Let us examine this transition together, as it is clinically fascinating. This was never a narrative of a benevolent protector and a helpless dependent. This attachment was synthesized in an environment of absolute paranoia and biological threat. When Arya verbalizes her commitment to remain, you can observe the ruthless syndicate leader physically decompress, dropping his heavily conditioned defenses. 2 years of behavioral adaptation pass. The terrified subject exhibiting acute panic on the bathroom tiles has been completely overwritten. Today, Arya stands before a reflective surface, adjusting the lapels of a tailored black suit. She embodies a crucial psychiatry reality. Genuine courage is not the total eradication of the fear response. It is experiencing the severe autonomic arousal, feeling the violent tremors in your extremities, and executing the action regardless. She never required a rescuer. She constructed her own. The previously sterile, sociopathic architecture of the penthouse has undergone a radical environmental shift. Warm illumination highlights visual evidence, photographs proving that 2 severely traumatized individuals successfully integrated their pathologies. The housekeeper interrupts the silence, noting that Mr. Varley awaits her presence. Arya produces a spontaneous, unforced vocalization of amusement. The criminal mastermind can still detect her baseline anxiety through the structural flooring. In the mirror, we observe a subject who now dictates the operational parameters of 40 violent enforcers across 3 urban centers. It provides us with a critical behavioral insight. External validation from the populace holds 0 clinical value, but synthesizing your own internal respect is the ultimate cognitive triumph. In the marble foyer, Leon waits. He observes his psychological equal with unfiltered territorial pride. Initiating her movement to the elevator, a fragmented traumatic memory surfaces. The freezing precipitation, the metallic taste of hemoglobin, the severe limbic panic of contacting Leon during a crisis. Reviewing the brutal architecture of her own conditioning, she realizes she would not alter a single psychological scar. We typically utilize immense energy to suppress our deepest traumas, yet experiencing a total psychological collapse does not equate to permanent weakness. The clinical irony is that the subjects who witness our most severe decompensation are often the only ones equipped to assist in the reconstruction. Leon intertwines his fingers with hers, providing a crucial somatic anchor. He questions her cognitive drift. She mentions their violent history. He issues a verbal warning about escalating threat levels. Her facial muscles form a subtle smile. The phobic response is eradicated. Now, she craves the dopamine of the conflict. The metallic doors seal shut, isolating the apex predator and his matched equal within a pressurized vacuum. As the cabin descends toward the chaotic urban environment, an acute wave of cognitive clarity stabilizes her nervous system. She analyzes their physical reflection in the polished brass, processing that the violently acquired assets of this organization belong equally to her. She did not achieve this level of dominance by maintaining a victim complex. When the environmental stresses reached their absolute peak, she engaged the threat directly and engineered her own survival. This leaves you and I with one final, unyielding psychiatric truth. You cannot waste your lifespan waiting for an external stabilizing force. You must weaponize your own intellect and rescue yourself. Once you master your own survival mechanisms, you become the singular architect of your psychological destiny.